Montana made headlines when it passed a statewide ban on TikTok, threatening the company and App Store operators $10,000 fines for every user. TikTok users are exempt, but if the ban takes effect on January 1st as scheduled, they presumably won't be able to use the app inside the state's borders. Last week on Markets, Scott predicted the ban would be struck down by the courts. TikTok users and the company itself have already filed 2 separate lawsuits. For more on the legal challenges to Montana's TikTok ban and how they would apply to an anticipated federal ban of the app, here's Prof G Media's editor-in-chief and a former attorney, Jason Stavers, with this week's Unpack.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, I think right off the top, every legal analyst that's taken a real look at Montana's ban will tell you this is not going to survive court review. And it's informative to understand why. And I think it also sheds some light on some of the challenges that proposed federal bans on TikTok might take. So you can think of court review of laws as like a maze, right? Legislatures pass a law, and then each law has to navigate a maze of limits that the Constitution puts on government power, right? So that's one of the fundamental things the Constitution does is it says, here are the things government can do, and here's a bunch of things the government can't do. And in large part, that's a series of rights that we've identified in the people that the government can't unduly burden. And when courts look at laws passed by states, there are even more limits on what state laws can do because the Constitution has taken certain domains and made them exclusively federal. And one of the challenges for Montana is that with this ban, they have stepped into at least 2 pretty significant areas that the Constitution reserves for the federal government. The first is interstate commerce. So states can manage the commerce that takes place within their own state. You can, for example, say how old someone has to be to buy alcohol. But what they can't do is burden commerce between the states. So California can't, for example, ban Oregon wine in California. They can ban wine, but not Oregon wine specifically. And they can't interfere too much with commerce between other states as well. So courts get very suspicious of that. Now, TikTok is clearly a nationwide platform, and there's a lot of commerce on TikTok, advertising, people selling things, et cetera. And so by trying to carve Montana out of that system, that Montana is limiting the ability of people outside Montana to reach in, people in Montana to reach out, and also interfering with people who are not Montana residents but happen to be passing through Montana or do business with people in Montana that's somehow connected with their use of TikTok. So that's something the federal government can do and does quite aggressively, but not something courts want to see Montana do. The next area is even more of a problem, right? The stated reason for this ban, or one of them anyway, is the concern that the Chinese government will somehow use TikTok to harm citizens of Montana. Well, that is very clearly within the realm of foreign policy. And foreign policy is very much something that the Constitution reserves to the federal government. For good reason, right? The U.S. should speak with one voice when it communicates outside. If we had 50 different governments all managing their own little mini foreign policies, it would be something of a mess. So courts are going to be very suspicious of a state law which purports to act in the foreign policy arena. Now, those are specific to state laws, right? A federal TikTok ban will not face either of those problems because these are things the federal government is allowed to do. The third problem with the Montana ban could have been avoided, and that is that this ban is likely to be considered what's called a bill of attainder. Bill of attainders have a colorful history. 600 years ago, Henry VIII was a big fan of bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is essentially a law that is passed to punish an individual. So normally when we want to punish an individual, we take them to court, right? And they get the due process of a court, potentially a jury, and everything else. Well, Henry VIII didn't want to take some of his political enemies to court. So he simply had Parliament, which he controlled, pass a law saying someone had committed various crimes. He used bills of attainder to execute, among other people, Thomas Cromwell and his 5th wife, Catherine. So when the framers drafted the Constitution, they said, we do not want George Washington deciding he can have his political opponents executed, so no bills of attainder. Now, this is actually a very easy problem to get around, and the federal bans that are being considered do this. All Montana had to do was say a certain class of companies, social media companies that are owned by adversarial governments, for example, are subject to this ban. Or they could have said companies subject to this ban will be determined by the executive, by the governor, based on some principles. And that is a typical way that Congress and state legislatures get around this issue. And it's also just more principled because it makes everything somewhat more clear. Instead, though, Montana, I mean, the ban itself, the statute is called a ban on TikTok. So that's a third problem. But that one applies to the federal government, but could be avoided. Okay, then we get to two more challenges. And I should say all three of those are probably enough to have the Montana ban knocked out. And courts will likely rely on those straightforward problems. But there are two very significant issues with this ban, which also apply to a federal ban. The first, which has gotten a lot of ventilation in the press, is that TikTok is a popular platform for speech. Yeah. And so courts do not allow the Congress to burden free speech unnecessarily. Here, TikTok will say, and TikTok users will say, look, TikTok allows us to communicate with so many people around the country and around the world in unique ways. And the proof of that is simply the popularity of TikTok, right? The government can say, sure, but there's other ways you can communicate. But it's quite clear that TikTok offers people something they can't get anywhere else. That's why so many people are flocking to TikTok. So courts will be very suspicious of a government attempt to limit that speech. And by banning the app entirely, they're completely eliminating that speech. There's another significant constitutional infirmity with these bans, though, that hasn't gotten as much attention, but I think is a very serious one. And that is the fact that TikTok accounts are valuable property for people who use them to make an income. And this is something that we're seeing in Montana right now. The first lawsuit against this statute was not filed by TikTok, but was filed by a group of TikTok users. Right. And they're very sympathetic plaintiffs, right? They say, hey, so for example, you have a former Marine who makes TikToks about life as a veteran, and she makes a significant portion of her income through her TikTok account. And then they had the wife of a rancher who TikToks about rural life. She has tripled her family's household income on the basis of her TikTok account. So a TikTok ban takes that property away. Well, the Constitution was put in place in substantial part to protect property rights from government intrusion. The government can't take your property without due process, meaning they have to give you an opportunity to defend your property. And if they take it for no other good reason, they have to compensate you for it. So it seems very unlikely, and I haven't seen any effort by these TikTok bans that are being proposed to develop some sort of compensation program or some sort of system for protecting the property rights of people who've built up some pretty substantial businesses on their TikTok accounts. So those two issues I think are pretty significant and could potentially be fatal to any TikTok ban. If the federal government passes a ban and they bring these arguments to court, what courts will do is they will weigh these issues, the burden on speech and the burden on property rights against the potential threat. So here, a challenge for the government is that the threat is largely hypothetical, right? They don't have evidence or much evidence that the Chinese government is actually doing any of the things that we're concerned about. Yeah, so courts are going to say, look, I mean, this sounds bad, but until you have proof that they're doing it, we're not going to eliminate millions of people's speech and property rights. The other thing courts will do is they will say, is this the most narrowly tailored thing that you could do to prevent this harm? And here I think the government has a real problem justifying a TikTok ban because the harms here are not really TikTok itself, but other things that the government of China or potentially TikTok are going to do. So I think courts and challengers to these laws can genuinely say, hey, why don't you do this? Why don't you enforce data privacy laws? Why don't you enforce disclosure laws? Or if the things that China is supposedly going to do are not yet illegal, make those things illegal. Make manipulating these accounts illegal, right? Make spying on Americans illegal, and then go enforce those laws. Yep. That's a much more narrowly focused approach that doesn't present nearly the same problems for speech and for property rights. So I think having looked at this, it's going to be tough for a federal ban on TikTok to survive court challenge. And I will say that what Montana did here was grandstanding. This law is poorly drafted and is not going to last. But It has served a useful function, which is that these conversations are often hard to pin down in the abstract. But when you get a law and you get a court case and lawyers begin to write briefs and pull plaintiffs into the situation, a lot of these issues get clearer and it becomes more apparent what is going to pass constitutional review and what's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people talk about it more, including this podcast.
Yeah.
Scott, Scott, you've come out in favor of a nationwide ban of TikTok. You cited the risks of Chinese government interference. Do you think it's worth it for Congress to take on what, as Jason has pointed out, looks like a very tough legal fight? Or should it try some other approach?
Jason's points are really interesting. I think that so courts are charged with interpreting the law as it stands. And my understanding is that as the law currently stands, they pretty much don't have a leg to stand on. Is that correct, Jason?
As the law currently stands, the Montana law?
The
Montana law is profoundly
The Montana
infirm.
governor in this proposed ban is just not going to stand legal scrutiny based on where laws are right now.
Yeah.
It's
notable that the governor actually tried to get them to revise the law substantially. He sent them a different draft and was like, guys, try this one. And that one is a lot less terrible. It wouldn't have survived either, but it's quite clear that the ban in Montana has so many problems. It's sort of embarrassing.
But this represents bad governance on a number of levels. One, what is your job? You should always ask yourself, what is your job? We try and ask ourselves that here. We try and educate people. We try and educate and entertain. That's our job. What is a governor's job? A governor's job is an operational job. It's an executive job. He's supposed to be figuring out how to get ranches water. He's supposed to make sure that prepare for the next series of wildfires in Montana. He's not there to kind of make sweeping changes and ban a media company. That's just not what a governor is supposed to do. If he wants to do that, he should run for Senate. In addition, the net effect of this will be helping TikTok because people are busy, and what they will see is that courts in the U.S. struck down a ban, which will make it more difficult to actually ban TikTok, which should be done through a new law passed by Congress. And that law has been proposed, the Restrict Act, which would give the Commerce Department the rights to ban a media outlet that is hosted in a country that is deemed adversarial. I think the list is Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China. That would be a law that would be a systemic solution that the federal government could then apply if it saw TikTok as a threat. That is how laws are made and how they're enforced. When a governor starts trying to pass laws that are going to be overturned because they don't hold up in court, that is a waste of everybody's time. And in the end, makes it less likely that the federal government is going to get to put in place a law that creates a systemic solution to do this correctly. Jason, what did I get right and wrong there?
Well, I think that I would largely agree with you with respect to the state situation. And as I said, the Constitution is very specific about some things that states just aren't supposed to do. And the Montana government is trying to do those things here. And I think that the systematic approach, putting in a law in place that the executive can implement when necessary, that's exactly right. Like, that's kind of how the system is supposed to work. I do think that in this particular case, it's going to be very difficult for a blanket ban on TikTok, no matter who promulgates it or how it's written, to survive constitutional scrutiny, because it is such a substantial burden on the speech rights of TikTok's users and a substantial burden on their rights to the property they have in these TikTok accounts. Now, that's not saying it's impossible. Both of those arguments will be challenged by the government in defense of these laws, and there are legal arguments you can make to try to get around those problems, but they're pretty significant. And given that there are likely more narrowly tailored ways to address the potential threat here, I think it's unlikely courts will permit a widespread total ban.
This was great. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah.